Hello everyone, and welcome to my YNR Official 24 channel. Summer's return to Genoa City didn't arrive with the fanfare of trumpets or the glare of flashing cameras, yet it landed with a quiet, seismic force that rippled through every familiar hallway and coffee-scented corner of the town, especially the fragile, carefully constructed world that Claire and Kyle had been building together piece by piece, because even before Summer stepped into the room, her presence was already felt in the way Kyle's posture stiffened when her name was mentioned, in the way his eyes briefly clouded with memories he never fully shared, and in the way Claire sensed, long before anyone confirmed it, that something old and unresolved was drifting back into their lives, something that refused to stay buried in the past. And as Summer crossed the threshold of the city she once called home, she carried with her a history so deeply intertwined with Kyle's that it was impossible for her return not to raise alarm bells, even if no one rang them out loud. Claire, perceptive and emotionally intelligent despite her relative newness to this particular social battlefield, noticed the subtle shifts almost immediately, the way Kyle checked his phone more often, the way his tone softened when Summer's name came up in conversation, not with longing exactly, but with a complicated blend of nostalgia, guilt, and unresolved responsibility, because Summer wasn't just an ex or a former love. She was a chapter of his life written in bold ink, a chapter that included shared ambitions, shared losses, and a child who connected them in ways that no amount of time or distance could ever fully erase. And Claire knew enough about Genoa City to understand that the past there never stayed in the past, it simply waited for the right moment to resurface. Summer's return, framed publicly as a temporary visit or a necessary business stop, quickly proved to be something far more destabilizing, because her presence reactivated old dynamics not just between her and Kyle, but within the larger Abbott-Newman orbit, creating a subtle pressure that seeped into Claire and Kyle's relationship like water through hairline cracks, invisible at first but increasingly impossible to ignore. And while Kyle reassured Claire with words, carefully chosen, earnest, and sincere, his actions sometimes betrayed a different story, not of betrayal but of divided attention, as though part of him had been pulled back into a time when Summer was his partner in crime, his equal in both love and ambition, someone who understood the unspoken rules of his world without needing explanation. Claire, for her part, tried to remain grounded, reminding herself that Kyle had chosen her, that their connection was built on honesty and a shared desire to move forward rather than backward. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that Summer's return wasn't just about rekindling old friendships or settling unfinished business, but about testing boundaries that had only recently been drawn. Because Summer had never been a passive observer in Kyle's life, she was a force, confident, assertive, and unafraid to claim space, and her interactions with Kyle reflected that history in every glance and half-smile, every private conversation that Claire wasn't part of, not necessarily inappropriate but intimate in a way that came from years of shared experience. What truly set off alarm bells for Claire wasn't a single dramatic moment but the accumulation of small ones. Kyle defending Summer instinctively in conversations where Claire had barely hinted at discomfort, Kyle downplaying Claire's concerns by insisting that Summer was family now, Kyle assuming that Claire would simply understand the complexities without needing reassurance, and in those moments Claire began to wonder whether she was being asked to compete with a ghost, or worse, with a living reminder of a love that had never fully resolved itself. Summer, intentionally or not, seemed to occupy a space in Kyle's life that no one else quite could, particularly when it came to co-parenting and the shared history of raising Harrison, because no matter how committed Kyle was to Claire, Summer represented a part of his identity that predated their relationship, and that history carried emotional weight that couldn't simply be wished away. And while Summer never openly challenged Claire or disrespected the relationship, her confidence and familiarity with Kyle created an undercurrent of tension that was impossible to miss, especially in group settings where she slipped seamlessly into old rhythms with him. Laughing at jokes that predated Claire's arrival, referencing memories that excluded her by default, the question of whether Summer's return could raise alarm bells wasn't just about jealousy or insecurity, but about the fundamental issue of whether Kyle had truly closed the door on that chapter of his life, or whether it remained ajar, vulnerable to being pushed open by circumstance, obligation, or unresolved emotion. And Claire found herself grappling with the fear that no matter how strong her bond with Kyle was, it might always exist in the shadow of something bigger, something more entrenched in the fabric of Genoa City itself. Kyle, to his credit, struggled visibly with the situation, torn between wanting to reassure Claire and wanting to do right by Summer and their shared responsibilities, and that internal conflict manifested in ways that only heightened the tension, because the more he tried to be everything to everyone, the more fragmented his attention became, leaving Claire feeling sidelined at times and Summer perhaps feeling more central than she intended to be, and this delicate balancing act raised uncomfortable questions about emotional boundaries, about whether it was possible to fully invest in a new relationship while still being so deeply entwined with an old one, especially when that old relationship came with ongoing ties that would never fully disappear. As days turned into weeks, Summer's presence continued to act as a catalyst, not necessarily by provoking overt conflict but by exposing vulnerabilities that Claire and Kyle hadn't yet addressed, forcing them to confront difficult conversations about trust, priority, and the future, conversations that might have been postponed indefinitely if not for Summer's return, and in that sense the alarm bells weren't just warnings of potential disaster but signals demanding attention, urging Claire and Kyle to examine the foundation of their relationship and decide whether it was strong enough to withstand the complexities of Kyle's past without resentment or fear. Claire's anxiety wasn't rooted in the belief that Kyle would cheat or betray her outright, but in the subtler, more insidious fear that emotional intimacy could be diluted, that decisions might be influenced by nostalgia rather than intention, and that in moments of crisis Kyle might instinctively turn to Summer rather than to her, not because he loved Summer more, but because old habits die hard, especially when forged in the crucible of shared history and mutual survival. Summer, meanwhile, existed in her own complicated emotional space, returning to a city that had shaped her, confronting unresolved feelings of her own, and navigating the delicate line between asserting her role in Kyle's life and respecting his current relationship. And while she may not have set out to disrupt anything, her mere presence challenged the illusion that the past could be neatly compartmentalized, reminding everyone involved that love, once real, leaves traces that don't simply fade with time. For Claire, the alarm bells ultimately became less about Summer herself and more about what Kyle's reactions revealed, about whether he was fully prepared to build a future that prioritized their partnership above all others, and whether he was willing to actively create space for Claire in areas of his life that had long been occupied by someone else. And as the tension simmered beneath the surface, the question remained unanswered. Could Summer's return coexist peacefully with Claire and Kyle's relationship, or was it destined to expose fractures that had always been there, waiting for the right trigger to bring them into the light? Because in Genoa City, returns are never simple, and the past has a way of demanding acknowledgement, whether the present is ready for it or not. As Summer's stay in Genoa City stretched beyond what anyone initially expected, the atmosphere around Claire and Kyle grew increasingly charged, not with explosive confrontations or dramatic ultimatums, but with a slow-burning tension that settled into the quiet moments, the pauses in conversation, the thoughtful looks Kyle wore when he believed Claire wasn't watching, and the way Claire found herself replaying interactions in her mind long after they were over, searching for meanings that Kyle insisted weren't there, because the most unsettling threats to a relationship often aren't loud or obvious, but subtle and cumulative, building weight over time until even the strongest foundation begins to feel strained. Claire tried to remind herself that relationships weren't meant to exist in a vacuum, that Kyle's life before her mattered and always would, yet the emotional labor of constantly being the understanding one, the patient one, began to take its toll, especially when it felt like Summer's role in Kyle's life was treated as immutable while Claire's place still felt negotiable, something that had to adapt around pre-existing bonds rather than being centered as the present and future. And this imbalance, real or perceived, was where the alarm bells truly began to ring, louder now, harder to dismiss as mere insecurity. Kyle, caught in the crosscurrents of loyalty and love, often underestimated the impact of his choices, believing that transparency alone was enough to keep everything balanced, yet transparency without reassurance can feel hollow, and Claire needed more than explanations. She needed to feel chosen in ways that were tangible and consistent, not just in private conversations but in public moments too, where Kyle's instinctive closeness with Summer sometimes left Claire feeling like an outsider in her own relationship. And even though Kyle would reach for her hand or offer a quick smile meant to ground her, those gestures sometimes felt reactive rather than intentional, as if he were responding to a problem rather than preventing one, and that distinction mattered more than he realized, because it spoke to whether he truly understood the depth of her discomfort or merely acknowledged it as something to manage until Summer inevitably left again. Summer herself became an increasingly complex figure in Claire's internal narrative, not a villain in the traditional sense, but a mirror reflecting all the uncertainties Claire tried to suppress, because Summer represented confidence born of familiarity, a woman who knew Kyle at his worst and his best, who had fought battles alongside him and survived losses that bonded them in ways few others could understand, and even when Summer behaved graciously, respectful of boundaries and careful not to overstep, her ease with Kyle served as a constant reminder that Claire was still learning the terrain of his emotional world while Summer had helped shape it, and that disparity made Claire question whether love alone was enough to bridge the gap between past and present, especially in a town where history often outweighed intention. As weeks passed, conversations that Claire and Kyle had been avoiding finally surfaced, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes painfully, but always with an undercurrent of urgency, because ignoring the issue had become impossible. Claire admitted, haltingly at first, that Summer's return made her feel replaceable, not because she believed Kyle wanted to go back to his past, but because the past seemed to hold such a powerful claim on him that it left little room for uncertainty, and uncertainty was exactly where Claire found herself, unsure of where she fit when the lines between obligation, affection, and habit blurred. Kyle, visibly shaken by her honesty, tried to reassure her by emphasizing that his life with Summer was no longer romantic, that his love for Claire was real and grounded in the present, yet even as he spoke, Claire could hear the unspoken caveat, that Summer would always be part of his life, always a priority in some form, and while that reality was understandable, it didn't erase the emotional impact of feeling perpetually second to a history she could never compete with. The true test of their relationship came not from Summer's actions, but from how crises were handled, because in moments of stress or decision-making, instincts reveal truths that words often conceal, and Claire couldn't help but notice that when complications arose involving Harrison or business entanglements connected to Summer, Kyle's reflex was to consult Summer first, to strategize with her before looping Claire in, and while Kyle defended this as practicality rather than preference, it nonetheless reinforced Claire's fear that when it came to matters of consequence, she was still peripheral, someone to be informed rather than involved, and this dynamic raised a painful question: could a relationship truly thrive if one partner remained partially anchored to a past partnership that still functioned, in many ways, as a unit? Summer, too, began to sense the strain her presence caused, and while she might not have articulated it openly, there were moments where her own vulnerability surfaced, subtle cracks in her composed exterior that suggested her return to Genoa City wasn't purely strategic or circumstantial, but emotional as well, tied to unresolved feelings about what her life had become and what she had left behind. And in quieter scenes, away from the watchful eyes of others, Summer and Kyle shared moments of reflection that bordered on intimacy, not romantic, but emotionally rich, filled with shared understanding and mutual respect, and those moments, though innocent in intent, carried a weight that Claire could feel even without witnessing them, because emotional intimacy has a way of echoing, of altering energy and priorities in ways that ripple outward. For Claire, the alarm bells reached a crescendo not when she saw Kyle and Summer together, but when she imagined a future where this dynamic never changed, where she would always have to negotiate space with someone who wasn't trying to take it but already occupied it by default, and that realization forced her to confront her own boundaries, to ask herself whether she was willing to accept a relationship that required constant adjustment, constant reassurance, and constant emotional resilience. Or whether love, to truly flourish, needed a sense of security that she wasn't sure Kyle could provide as long as Summer remained such a central presence. This internal reckoning wasn't driven by jealousy so much as self-preservation, because Claire understood that love without stability eventually erodes, leaving behind exhaustion rather than fulfillment. Kyle, faced with the possibility of losing Claire not to betrayal but to emotional attrition, began to recognize the seriousness of the situation, understanding at last that neutrality wasn't enough, that in trying to keep everyone happy he risked losing the person he claimed to love most, and this realization marked a turning point, because it forced him to evaluate his priorities not just intellectually but emotionally, to consider what it meant to fully commit to a future with Claire while honoring his responsibilities to Summer in a way that didn't compromise that commitment. And this balancing act required more than good intentions. It required deliberate choices, visible boundaries, and a willingness to disrupt long-standing habits that felt comfortable but were no longer appropriate. Whether Summer's return ultimately spelled danger or growth for Claire and Kyle depended on what followed these realizations, because alarm bells don't exist solely to warn of disaster. They exist to prompt action, to demand awareness before it's too late, and in this case, Summer's presence exposed truths that might otherwise have remained hidden beneath the surface of affection and optimism, revealing both the strengths and the vulnerabilities of Claire and Kyle's bond. If Kyle could learn to center Claire not just in words but in instinct, to invite her fully into the parts of his life that had once been exclusive to someone else, and if Claire could find reassurance not in comparison but in consistency, then Summer's return might serve as a crucible that strengthened their relationship rather than shattering it. Yet the possibility of loss lingered, because Genoa City has a long memory and a habit of resurrecting unfinished stories, and Summer's return was a reminder that love is rarely a clean slate, but a layering of experiences, choices, and consequences that must be actively managed rather than passively endured. And as Claire and Kyle stood at this crossroads, the question wasn't simply whether Summer's return raised alarm bells, but whether those bells would lead to clarity or chaos, because sometimes the greatest threat to a relationship isn't an old love returning, but the failure to confront what that return reveals about the present. As the tension surrounding Summer's continued presence settled into a kind of uneasy normal, Claire began to notice changes not just in Kyle, but in herself, subtle shifts in how she navigated the relationship, because where she had once spoken freely and trusted instinctively, she now found herself measuring her words, choosing silence over honesty at times simply to avoid appearing insecure. And that internal self-censorship became its own warning sign, a quiet indicator that the emotional cost of accommodating unresolved history was starting to outweigh the comfort of the connection itself. This internal conflict made Claire reflect on what she truly needed from a partner, not perfection, not exclusivity from the past, but clarity, the kind that allowed her to feel safe enough to be fully herself without fear of comparison or displacement. And in moments of solitude she questioned whether Kyle, despite his love for her, was emotionally available in the way a lasting partnership required. Kyle, meanwhile, found himself increasingly confronted by the consequences of avoidance, realizing that the unspoken strain between him and Claire was affecting not just their private moments but the overall tone of their relationship, because affection without ease begins to feel performative, and even simple gestures, shared meals, casual laughter, quiet evenings, were now shadowed by an awareness of what wasn't being said, and this realization pushed Kyle into a period of introspection, forcing him to examine why he clung so tightly to old patterns with Summer, whether out of guilt, habit, or a fear of redefining himself outside of that long-standing dynamic. And in confronting those questions he began to understand that honoring the past didn't have to mean living in it, but it did require the courage to let certain versions of himself evolve. The moment that crystallized everything came not during a dramatic showdown but in a quiet exchange, when Claire finally voiced what she had been holding back, telling Kyle that she didn't feel like his partner when it mattered most, that she felt like an addition to a life that already felt complete without her, and those words landed with a weight that Kyle couldn't deflect or rationalize, because they cut to the heart of the issue. Not Summer's presence, not jealousy, but the absence of intentional prioritization. And in that moment Kyle saw clearly that love alone wasn't enough to sustain a relationship if it wasn't accompanied by actions that reinforced belonging and security. Faced with this truth, Kyle was forced to make choices that went beyond reassurance, choices that required visible change, and while those changes wouldn't erase history or dissolve ongoing responsibilities, they could redefine how that history interacted with the present, and for the first time since Summer's return, Claire allowed herself to imagine a future that didn't revolve around constant comparison, one where she could trust that when challenges arose, she would be Kyle's first instinct, rather than an afterthought, and whether that future became reality depended not on Summer leaving Genoa City, but on Kyle demonstrating through consistent behavior that his commitment to Claire was active, deliberate, and resilient enough to withstand the echoes of the past.